The thread moved on its own that November morning in 1832. It slithered across the pine wood floor of the Charleston plantation house like a living thing, pulling from a spool that rolled without being touched. The quilt lay draped across the wooden chair near the hearth, and when Margaret Witfield pressed her palm against the fabric, she jerked her hand back. The cloth was warm, as if someone had just been sitting beneath it, working the needle through cotton and dreams. But Ruthanne was gone. The breakfast dishes sat unwashed in the kitchen basin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers that nobody had stoked since dawn. And in the slave quarters behind the main house, Ruthanne's sleeping mat lay undisturbed, her few possessions arranged exactly as they had been the night before. Nobody had seen her leave. Nobody heard footsteps in the dark, but somewhere between midnight and morning she had vanished, leaving behind only that half-finished quilt and a mystery that would haunt Charleston's Witfield estate for generations to come. The question wasn't just where she had gone, but how she had managed to disappear from a place where every moment of her life had been watched, controlled, and owned by someone else. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Ruthanne had been stitching that particular quilt for 3 months before she disappeared, working by candlelight after her daily tasks were finished after the Whitfield family had retired to their bedchambers and the overseer had made his final rounds through the quarters. She worked with scraps of fabric that Margaret Witfield allowed the enslaved women to collect from the sewing room. Pieces of calico and cotton that had been trimmed away from dresses and curtains and tablecloths. The pattern she chose was unusual, not one of the traditional designs that most quilters in Charleston followed. Instead of simple squares or triangles arranged in predictable rows, Ruthanne created something that looked almost like a map, with winding paths that curved and intersected with patches of dark blue fabric that could have been rivers or could have been sky, with small yellow pieces stitched in patterns that resembled stars or flowers or signals that only certain eyes could read. The other women in the quarters noticed the quilt taking shape, but they asked no questions. There was an unspoken understanding among them that some things were better left unexamined, that survival sometimes depended on not knowing too much about what others were planning or thinking or dreaming in the dark hours before dawn. Ruthanne herself spoke little about the project. She was 24 years old that autumn, tall and strong from years of work in the Whitfield household, with hands that could scrub floors and knead bread and stitch tiny, perfect seams that held fast no matter how much wear the fabric endured. She had been born on the estate, delivered by her mother in a cabin that no longer stood, raised among children who had been sold away one by one as they grew old enough to fetch good prices at the Charleston market. Margaret Witfield considered herself a kind mistress, a woman who provided adequate food and shelter for her slaves, who allowed them to attend Sunday services at the small chapel on the edge of the property, who even permitted them to keep small vegetable gardens behind their quarters where they could grow collards and beans and okra for their own tables. She believed that her benevolence distinguished her from other plantation owners, that her household ran smoothly because she treated her property with a degree of humanity that others lacked. She never struck her slaves herself, though she employed an overseer who did not share her squeamishness about physical discipline. She made sure they had warm blankets in winter and enough cornmeal and salt pork to keep them healthy and productive. And when Ruthanne showed a particular talent for fine needlework, Margaret had taken her out of the fields permanently and installed her in the main house, where she worked alongside the cook and the housemaids, mending clothes and hemming curtains and creating the delicate embroidery that adorned Margaret's finest linens. The morning of Ruthanne's disappearance began like any other. Margaret woke at dawn to find the fire in her bedroom hearth had gone cold, which was unusual because Ruthanne always arrived before sunrise to stoke the flames and lay out Margaret's morning clothes. When an hour passed and Ruthanne still had not appeared, Margaret sent her personal maid to the quarters to fetch the missing seamstress. The maid returned alone, confused and frightened, reporting that Ruthanne was nowhere to be found. Her sleeping mat was cold. The other women claimed they had not seen her since the previous evening when everyone had retired after supper. Margaret descended the stairs in her dressing gown, her hair still in the nighttime braid that Ruthanne normally helped her unbraid and brush each morning. She moved through the lower floor of the house, checking each room with growing irritation that slowly transformed into something closer to unease. In the small sewing room off the main parlor, she found the half-finished quilt draped across the chair where Ruthanne always sat to work. The needle was still threaded, stuck into the fabric as if the seamstress had simply paused mid-stitch and intended to return at any moment. But when Margaret touched the quilt, she felt that inexplicable warmth, as if the fabric itself held the heat of living flesh. The search began immediately. Marcus Witfield, Margaret's husband, sent the overseer and 3 field hands to scour the property. They checked every building, every shed and barn and smokehouse. They walked the perimeter of the estate, looking for broken fencing or disturbed earth that might indicate where someone had slipped through the boundaries. They questioned every slave on the property, demanding to know if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. The interrogations grew harsh as the day wore on and no trace of Ruthanne emerged. The overseer, a lean man named Carver who had worked for the Whitfields for 7 years, employed methods that left several people with bruises and split lips, but nobody offered any useful information. Either they genuinely knew nothing, or they had mastered the art of protecting their secrets even under duress. By evening, Marcus Witfield had contacted the authorities in Charleston, reporting a runaway slave and offering a reward for her capture and return. He placed advertisements in the local newspapers describing Ruthanne's appearance in detail. Tall, approximately 5 feet 8 inches, with dark brown skin and a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Probably wearing a simple gray cotton dress and possibly carrying a small bundle of possessions. The reward he offered was substantial, $100, enough to motivate every slave catcher and opportunistic citizen in the region to keep watch for a woman matching that description. What none of them understood, what they could not have comprehended even if someone had tried to explain it, was that Ruthanne had not run in the conventional sense. She had not slipped through fences or hidden in the back of a sympathetic merchant's wagon. She had not followed the North Star toward freedom in distant states. Instead, she had done something far stranger, something that involved the quilt and the patterns she had stitched into it, something that connected to knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that fabric and thread could carry more than just warmth and decoration. 3 days after Ruthanne's disappearance, a peculiar thing happened in the Witfield household. Margaret had taken up the unfinished quilt, intending to complete it herself or perhaps to give it to one of the other seamstresses to finish. She needed bed coverings for the winter months, and she saw no reason to waste good fabric and hours of work simply because the original stitcher had run away. But when she sat down with the quilt in her lap and picked up the needle that still hung from its last stitch, she found herself unable to make the needle pierce the cloth. Her hand would move toward the fabric, but at the last moment her fingers would veer away. As if some invisible force pushed the needle aside, she tried repeatedly, growing increasingly frustrated, but each attempt ended the same way. The needle would not enter the cloth. That night, Margaret dreamed of Ruthanne. In the dream, the seamstress stood in a place that resembled the plantation but was subtly different, as if she existed in a version of the estate that occupied the same space but a different time or dimension. Ruthanne was stitching, her needle moving rapidly through a piece of fabric that seemed to shift and change colors as Margaret watched. When Ruthanne looked up and met Margaret's eyes, her expression was neither angry nor triumphant. Instead, she appeared calm, focused, as if she was engaged in work that required her complete attention and concentration. She spoke no words, but the message was clear. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do, and no amount of searching or reward money would bring her back. Margaret woke from the dream with her heart pounding. She tried to dismiss it as mere anxiety, the natural result of losing a valuable slave and dealing with the disruption to her household routine. But the dream repeated itself the following night, and the night after that, always with slight variations but always conveying the same essential message. Ruthanne was not suffering. She was not hiding in terror in some swamp or forest. She had gone somewhere, but that somewhere was not a place that could be reached by following roads or rivers or even by searching every corner of the Charleston region. As weeks passed and autumn deepened toward winter, strange occurrences continued in the Witfield house. The thread spool that had rolled across the floor on the morning of Ruthanne's disappearance began to appear in different locations, always moving when nobody was looking, always trailing thread behind it as if drawing invisible patterns through the rooms. Servants reported hearing the sound of humming late at night, a low melodic sound that seemed to come from the sewing room. But whenever anyone investigated, the room was empty and silent. The half-finished quilt remained on its chair, and despite Margaret's orders that someone should complete it, no one could successfully add a single stitch to Ruthanne's work. The fabric resisted every attempt as if it had been sealed somehow, locked in the exact state it had occupied when its creator departed. Marcus Whitfield grew impatient with the situation. The loss of one slave should not have created such disruption, but somehow Ruthanne's absence had thrown off the entire rhythm of the household. The other slaves worked more slowly, as if waiting for something. The cook burned meals that she had prepared perfectly for years. The housemaids left tasks half-finished or forgot instructions they had followed countless times before. It was as if Ruthanne's disappearance had created a hole in the fabric of daily life, and everything nearby was slowly unraveling, pulled toward that empty space. In the slave quarters, the women gathered in the evenings and spoke in low voices about what had really happened. They did not speak of running away or of the Underground Railroad, though some of them knew about the secret networks that helped enslaved people escape to the north. They spoke, instead of older knowledge, of things their grandmothers and great-grandmothers had known, of practices that had traveled across the ocean in the memories of people stolen from their homes and forced into bondage in a strange land. They spoke of how fabric could be more than fabric, how patterns could hold power, how a person who knew the right combinations of color and shape and stitch could create doorways that led somewhere other than north or south or east or west. One of the older women, a woman named Abeni who had been born in West Africa and brought to Charleston as a child 60 years earlier, confirmed what the others suspected. She had seen Ruthanne's quilt and had recognized some of the patterns. The winding paths were not random designs but careful recreations of symbols that Abeni's own mother had taught her. Symbols that represented transition and transformation, that marked the boundaries between what was seen and what was hidden, that could, in the hands of someone who truly understood their power, create passages between worlds. Ruthanne had been learning these things for years, Abeni explained, watching and listening whenever the older women spoke of the old ways, asking careful questions that never revealed too much but always indicated that she was gathering knowledge with a specific purpose in mind. The quilt was a map, yes, but not the kind of map that showed geographical locations. It was a map of possibility, a representation of a place that existed alongside the world of plantations and slave markets and cruelty. A place where different rules applied, where the people who had been stolen and bought and sold could exist in a different way. Creating such a map required more than just skill with needle and thread. It required belief, the kind of bone-deep certainty that what you were stitching into being was real. That the patterns you created were not just decorative but functional. That when you pulled the thread tight and knotted it off, You were not just finishing a seam, but opening a door. The women in the quarters understood that they could not speak of these things openly. To do so would be to invite punishment, to mark themselves as knowing too much about things that made white people nervous and suspicious. So they spoke carefully, in metaphors and half-finished sentences, and they never mentioned Ruthanne's name when the overseer or any of the Witfield family members were within earshot. But among themselves they celebrated quietly. Ruthanne had done something remarkable. She had found a way out that had nothing to do with running through dangerous territory with dogs and slave catchers on her trail. She had stitched herself a doorway and stepped through it, leaving behind only that warm quilt and the mystery of her vanishing. Winter came to Charleston with unusual cold that year. Frost appeared on the windows of the Whitfield house, and the fire in the main parlor seemed unable to fully warm the rooms no matter how much wood the servants fed into it. Margaret wrapped herself in shawls and complained constantly about the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. She found herself thinking about Ruthanne more than she wanted to admit, wondering not so much where the woman had gone, but how she had managed it. What secret knowledge she had possessed that had allowed her to simply disappear from a place where escape should have been impossible. The half-finished quilt remained on its chair in the sewing room, and Margaret found herself drawn to it repeatedly, standing in the doorway and staring at the intricate patterns that Ruthanne had created. The longer she looked at it, the more she saw in the designs. What had initially appeared to be abstract arrangements of colored fabric began to resolve into shapes that suggested meaning, paths that seemed to lead somewhere, stars that might have served as guides or markers. Margaret was not a foolish woman. She had received a decent education for her time and social class, could read and write and manage household accounts. But she had never believed in anything she could not touch or measure or verify through direct observation. The quilt challenged those certainties. It suggested that there were other ways of knowing, other forms of power that had nothing to do with ownership or law or physical force. One evening in late December, as Margaret sat alone in the parlor with the quilt draped across her lap, she felt it again. That warmth that had startled her on the morning of Ruthanne's disappearance. The fabric was warm, almost hot, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight even though the evening was dark and cold. She ran her fingers over the stitches, following the paths that Ruthanne had created, tracing the patterns that wound and intersected and spiraled across the cloth. And as she touched the fabric, she thought she felt something else. A kind of vibration or pulse, as if the quilt was alive in some fundamental way. She thought of Ruthanne sitting in this same chair night after night, working by candlelight, pulling thread through cotton and creating something that was both a functional blanket and something far more significant. She thought about what it must have been like to be owned, to have every moment of your life controlled by someone else. To know that your children, if you had any, would be born into the same captivity, that there was no legal or social mechanism by which you could ever claim freedom. And she thought about the courage it must have taken to believe that fabric and thread could create a way out, to invest weeks and months in stitching patterns that might do nothing at all or might open a door to somewhere else. For the first time since Ruthanne had disappeared, Margaret felt something other than irritation at the disruption to her household. She felt a strange, uncomfortable mixture of awe and fear and something that might have been respect. Whatever Ruthanne had done, it was not the act of a simple runaway. It was something far more deliberate and complex, something that required knowledge and skill that Margaret had never imagined an enslaved woman could possess. The search for Ruthanne eventually died down. The advertisements in the newspapers expired. The slave catchers reported no sightings. It was as if she had simply vanished from the world, leaving no trace except that quilt and the stories that the people in the quarters told in quiet voices when they thought no one was listening. Marcus Whitfield eventually replaced her with another seamstress, a younger woman who could do acceptable work with needle and thread, but who lacked Ruthanne's particular talent for intricate patterns. Life on the plantation resumed its normal rhythms, or tried to, though there remained an odd, unsettled quality to the household, as if everyone was waiting for something without quite knowing what they were waiting for. Years passed. The Whitfield estate changed hands when Marcus died in 1843, and Margaret, grown old and bitter, moved to live with relatives in Richmond. The new owners of the property, a merchant family from Philadelphia who knew little about running a plantation, eventually sold off most of the slaves and converted the land to different purposes. The main house stood empty for a time, then was occupied by a series of tenants, none of whom stayed very long. They all reported the same strange phenomena: the sound of humming late at night, the sensation of warmth coming from certain rooms even when the fires were cold, the feeling that someone was watching them from corners that held nothing but shadows. The quilt disappeared sometime in the 1850s. Nobody could say exactly when or how. It had been stored in a trunk in one of the upstairs bedrooms, carefully wrapped in muslin to protect it from dust and moths. But when the trunk was opened during a general cleaning, the quilt was gone. The muslin wrapping remained, still folded in the shape that had contained the fabric, but the quilt itself had vanished as completely as its creator. Some said it had finally completed its purpose and had ceased to exist in the material world. Others believed it had been stolen, though nobody could imagine who would have taken it or how they would have gotten past the locked trunk and the closed bedroom door. What happened to Ruthanne Jones, where she went when she stepped through the doorway her quilt had created, nobody could say with certainty. But in the years that followed her disappearance, stories began to circulate among the enslaved people of Charleston and the surrounding plantations. They spoke of a place that existed just beyond sight, a space that opened up when certain conditions were met, when the right patterns were stitched, or the right songs were sung, or the right words were spoken. They said it was not exactly freedom, not in the way that people thought of freedom as a northern state or a foreign country where slavery was illegal. Instead, it was a kind of elsewhere, a pocket universe that had been created through centuries of determination and belief in need, where people who had been taken from their homes and forced into bondage could exist in a different way. Some said that others had followed Ruthanne over the years, that they had learned the patterns she had discovered and had created their own doorways using quilts or songs or drawings scratched in the dirt. They said these people lived in a community that mirrored the physical world but operated according to different rules, where the violence and cruelty of slavery could not reach them, where they could speak their own languages and practice their own customs and raise their children without fear. They said that sometimes on certain nights when the conditions were right, you could almost see this place, could catch glimpses of it out of the corner of your eye, could hear the sound of voices speaking and laughing and singing in the distance, though when you turned to look directly, there would be nothing there but darkness or empty fields or the familiar buildings of the plantation. These stories were dangerous to tell, of course. They suggested that enslaved people had access to forms of power and knowledge that their owners knew nothing about, that they were not simply property to be bought and sold, but people with connections to traditions and practices that predated their captivity. The owners and overseers who heard whispers of such stories dismissed them as superstition, as the primitive beliefs of people who had not been properly civilized or Christianized. But the fact that they dismissed the stories did not make them less powerful or less important to the people who believed in them. Ruthanne's disappearance became a kind of legend, a story that was passed down through generations, that evolved and changed as it traveled from mouth to mouth but always retained its essential truth. That a woman who had been enslaved, who had been owned and controlled and denied the most basic human freedoms, had found a way to create her own liberation through the power of her craft and her knowledge and her absolute refusal to accept that the world as it existed was the only world that could exist. She had stitched herself a doorway and she had walked through it, and she had left behind only warmth and mystery and the suggestion that there were other ways of being that had nothing to do with what the law allowed or what society accepted. In the sewing room of the old Witfield house, even after the quilt disappeared and the building changed hands multiple times and was eventually abandoned and left to decay, something remained. People who wandered through the ruins reported feeling warmth in that particular room even in the dead of winter when snow covered the ground and ice hung from the eaves. They reported seeing threads on the floor that seemed to move on their own, arranging themselves into patterns that lasted only moments before dissolving back into randomness. They reported the sense that someone had just been there, had just stepped out of the room an instant before they entered, leaving behind only the echo of presence and the lingering heat of living flesh. As the 19th century progressed and the Civil War came and went and slavery was abolished through law rather than through the mysterious doorways that women like Ruthanne had created, the story of her disappearance took on new meanings. Some saw it as a historical curiosity, an example of the folklore and magical thinking that had existed among enslaved people. Others understood it as something more significant, as evidence that resistance to oppression took many forms, that people found ways to survive and even thrive under conditions that should have destroyed them, that creativity and determination and cultural knowledge could create possibilities that seemed impossible according to the logic of the dominant society. Scholars who studied the history of slavery in Charleston eventually came across references to Ruthanne Jones in old plantation records and newspaper advertisements. They noted the unusual circumstances of her disappearance, the lack of any trail or evidence of escape, the strange stories that had circulated in the years following her vanishing. Most treated it as an unsolved mystery, one of many instances where an enslaved person had managed to escape despite what seemed like insurmountable obstacles. A few looked deeper, researching the traditions of textile work among African and African American women, documenting the ways that quilts had been used to carry coded messages and preserve cultural knowledge, exploring the possibility that some craft practices might have had purposes and powers that went beyond the merely functional or decorative. One researcher, a woman named Dr. Helena Pierce, who published a comprehensive study of plantation life in Charleston in 1972, devoted an entire chapter to Ruthanne's story. She had tracked down descendants of some of the people who had been enslaved on the Witfield estate, had recorded their oral histories and the stories that had been passed down through their families. What emerged from her research was a portrait of Ruthanne as a woman who had been quiet and methodical, who had attracted little attention from the Witfield family or the overseer, who had gone about her work efficiently while all the time gathering knowledge and preparing for something that nobody around her suspected. Dr. Pierce documented the significance of the quilt patterns that witnesses described, connecting them to symbols used in West African textile traditions, to designs that appeared in quilts made by other enslaved women in different parts of the South, to visual languages that had been preserved and transmitted across generations despite every effort to suppress African cultural practices and impose European American norms. She argued that Ruthanne's quilt was not simply a beautiful piece of craft work but a sophisticated text, a carefully constructed artifact that encoded knowledge and belief and intention in ways that only certain people would have been able to fully read or understand. The question of what actually happened to Ruthanne, where she went when she disappeared from the Witfield estate that November morning in 1832, Dr. Pierce left deliberately open. She presented the various explanations that had been offered over the years, that Ruthanne had escaped through conventional means and had simply been more successful at evading capture than most runaways, that she had died somewhere in the woods or swamps surrounding Charleston and her body had never been found, that she had been helped by the Underground Railroad or sympathetic white people and had made it to freedom in the North or Canada. But she also presented the other explanation, the one that the people who had known Ruthanne best believed, that she had used her knowledge of old traditions to create a doorway to somewhere else, that she had stitched her way out of slavery into a place that existed just beyond the reach of her captors. Dr. Pierce's work was not widely read outside academic circles, but it influenced a generation of scholars who studied the history and culture of enslaved people in America. It contributed to a growing understanding that the people who had been forced into bondage were not simply victims, were not simply people to whom things were done, but were active agents in their own lives. People who resisted and adapted and created and preserved in ways that were often invisible to their oppressors but were nonetheless powerful and significant. The old Witfield estate eventually disappeared. The main house, which had stood empty and decaying for decades, was torn down in the early 21st century to make way for a housing development. The land where the slave quarters had stood became a parking lot. The fields where enslaved people had grown rice and cotton and indigo were covered with shopping centers and office buildings. The physical traces of that world were erased, paved over, replaced with the structures and systems of contemporary life. But the story of Ruthanne persisted. It was retold in books and documentaries, in museum exhibits about plantation life and slavery in the South, in artistic works that drew inspiration from her act of resistance and disappearance. Some of these retellings treated the story as metaphor, as a symbolic representation of the desire for freedom and the creativity that oppressed people employed to survive. Others took the supernatural elements more seriously, suggesting that there were aspects of historical experience that could not be fully captured or explained through conventional historical methods, that some truths required different forms of understanding and belief. In Charleston, which had transformed itself from a slave trading port into a modern city that struggled with its complicated history, Ruthanne's story became part of the local folklore. Tour guides mentioned her when they led groups through the historic district, pointing out the approximate location of the Witfield estate, describing the mysterious disappearance and the quilt that had remained warm long after its creator had vanished. Some of these tour guides presented the story as fact, while others framed it more carefully as legend or folk tale. But regardless of how they presented it, the story resonated with people, touched something deep about the human need to believe that escape was possible even from situations that seemed absolutely hopeless. And sometimes, even in the modern city with its traffic and its tourists and its carefully preserved historic buildings, strange things happened. People reported seeing threads lying on sidewalks, arranging themselves in patterns that resembled the designs Ruthanne had stitched into her quilt before they scattered in the wind. Shop owners in the historic district told stories about feeling sudden warmth in certain corners of their buildings, about hearing humming late at night when they were closing up, about the sense that someone was working nearby, someone whose presence could be felt but not seen. These occurrences were rare and easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination, but for those who believed in the possibility of doors between worlds, they served as reminders that Ruthanne's legacy had not been erased by time or urban development. The question of whether Ruthanne's quilt had created an actual doorway to another dimension or had simply been a beautiful piece of craftwork that accompanied her more conventional escape would never be definitively answered. The evidence was too ambiguous, too dependent on testimony from people who had every reason to preserve their secrets and protect their knowledge from those who held power over them. But perhaps the truth of the story was not primarily about whether the supernatural events actually occurred in the way they were described. Perhaps the truth was about what people needed to believe in order to survive, about the power of hope and determination and cultural memory to sustain life even under conditions designed to destroy it. Ruthanne Jones, whether she walked through a doorway stitched from cotton and thread or escaped through more conventional means, had done something that seemed impossible. She had freed herself from a system that was supposed to be absolute and inescapable. She had used her skills and her knowledge and her courage to create a different outcome than the one that had been prescribed for her by law and custom and the economic interests of people who saw her as property rather than as a human being. And in doing so, she had given hope to others, had demonstrated that resistance was possible, that creativity could be a form of power, that the world as it existed was not the only world that could exist. The half-finished quilt, wherever it ended up, whether it disintegrated into dust or transformed into something else or continued to exist in some unseen dimension, remained a symbol of that possibility. It represented the work of creating freedom, the patient accumulation of knowledge and skill, the willingness to believe in something beyond what seemed rational or possible according to the dominant culture's understanding of reality. It was a reminder that some of the most important historical events leave no conventional evidence, that some acts of resistance and liberation happen in ways that can only be understood through story and memory, and the preservation of cultural knowledge across generations. On cold November mornings in Charleston, if you walk through the neighborhoods that once held plantations, if you listen carefully to the wind moving through live oak trees draped with Spanish moss, you might hear something that sounds like humming, a low melodic sound that could be the wind or could be something else. You might feel a warmth that has no visible source, might notice threads lying on the ground in patterns that seem deliberate rather than random. And if you are willing to believe, if you can accept that the world contains more possibilities than what can be measured or proven or contained within conventional historical narratives, you might sense the presence of those who refuse to accept their captivity, who found ways to create doorways where none seemed to exist, who stitched themselves into being in worlds beyond the reach of those who claim to own them. Ruthanne of Charleston left behind a mystery, yes, but she also left behind a legacy. She demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, even when every form of power seemed to be arrayed against you, it was possible to create something new, to find or make a path that led somewhere other than the destination that had been assigned to you. She showed that creativity and knowledge and determination were forms of power that could rival the legal and physical force of slavery. She proved that a woman with needle and thread and absolute clarity of purpose could change the world, or at least could change her own place in it, could step from one world into another, leaving behind only warmth and wonder and the whisper of possibility. The thread still moves sometimes, trailing across floors and buildings that now serve completely different purposes than they did in 1832. The patterns still emerge in unexpected places, arrangements of lint or dust or fallen leaves that seem too deliberate to be accidental. And people still tell the story, still pass down the knowledge that Ruthanne possessed and used, still stitch their own versions of the pattern she created, not necessarily to open doorways between worlds, but to remember that such doorways might exist, that the people who came before us found ways to survive and resist and create that we cannot fully imagine or comprehend, but that we can honor through the preservation of their stories. Ruthanne Jones disappeared on a November morning in 1832, leaving behind a quilt that was still warm, still breathing with the heat of her presence, still unfinished because the work of liberation is always unfinished, always in process, always requiring the contribution of new stitches and new patterns and new hands willing to pull thread through fabric and create something that did not exist before. She walked out of slavery into mystery, and in doing so, she became something more than a runaway slave or a lost piece of property. She became a legend, a symbol, a reminder that the human spirit cannot be fully contained or controlled no matter how sophisticated the systems designed to accomplish that control. Her story survives because people needed it to survive, because it carried truth about resistance and creativity and the power of cultural knowledge that could not be expressed in conventional historical documents or legal records. It survives because it insists that there are other ways of knowing and being, that the world contains more possibilities than what those in power want us to believe, that a woman with needle and thread and determination can create miracles that reshape reality according to her own vision, rather than the vision imposed upon her by others. The quilt is gone now, vanished as completely as its creator, but its warmth remains. Its patterns persist in memory and story. Its half-finished state reminds us that the work continues, that each generation must take up the needle and add their own stitches to the fabric of liberation. Ruthanne began the work that November morning when she walked out of the Witfield estate and into legend. The rest of us, 2 centuries later, are still pulling thread through cotton, still creating patterns that might become doorways, still believing that escape is possible even when all evidence suggests otherwise, still warming ourselves with the heat that emanates from fabric stitched by hands that refused to accept the world as it was and insisted on creating something different. And on very quiet mornings, if you stand in the right place at the right time, you might feel it yourself. That warmth that comes from nowhere visible, that suggests the presence of someone who is no longer physically present but whose work continues, whose patterns still hold power, whose act of liberation still resonates across time and space and the boundaries between worlds. You might feel the quilt that was never finished being completed stitch by stitch through the accumulation of stories and memories and beliefs, through the refusal of subsequent generations to forget that a woman named Ruthanne Jones found a way out and left the door open behind her for others who might need to follow. That is the gift she left, more valuable than any quilt, no matter how beautifully stitched, more lasting than any physical artifact could ever be. She left the knowledge that doors exist if you know how to create them, that fabric can be more than fabric, that the work of hands can change the structure of reality if those hands belong to someone who truly believes in what they are creating. She left warmth in cold places, patterns in the chaos, the possibility of elsewhere when here becomes unbearable. She left the example of her courage and her creativity and her absolute refusal to accept that the life she had been assigned was the only life available to her. And that thread, that single strand of cotton that pulled away from the spool on the morning she disappeared, still unwinds somewhere, still trails through rooms and across fields and between worlds, still connects past to present and reality to possibility, still marks the path that Ruthanne walked from slavery into freedom, from captivity into mystery, from the world that tried to own her into the world that she created for herself, through the power of her knowledge and her craft and her unbreakable determination to be free. The legacy of Ruthanne's disappearance extended far beyond the boundaries of the Witfield estate and the immediate years following her vanishing. In 1847, 15 years after she had walked away from slavery, a similar incident occurred on a plantation 30 miles upriver from Charleston. A young woman named Constance, known for her skill with weaving and dyeing fabric, disappeared under circumstances that eerily mirrored Ruthanne's case. She too left behind unfinished work, a length of woven cloth that remained warm to the touch for days after her disappearance. She too had been working on patterns that the other enslaved people recognized as significant, as carrying meanings that went deeper than mere decoration. And she too vanished without a trace, despite searches that scoured every inch of the property and the surrounding countryside. The plantation owner, a man named Caldwell who had heard the stories about Ruthanne Jones, became obsessed with understanding how his property could simply walk away without leaving any evidence of escape. He brought in tracking dogs, hired professional slave catchers with years of experience, offered rewards that exceeded the actual market value of the missing woman. But nothing produced results. Constance was gone as completely as Ruthanne had been, and the only thing left behind was that warm cloth and the growing suspicion among the white population of the region that something deeply unsettling was happening. Something that challenged their understanding of how the world worked and how much control they actually had over the people they claimed to own. Caldwell interviewed every enslaved person on his property, using methods that ranged from gentle questioning to brutal interrogation. He wanted to know what they knew about these disappearances, what secrets were being kept, what knowledge was being transmitted among the slave population that allowed people to escape in ways that seemed impossible. But the people he questioned maintained their silence or offered explanations that told him nothing useful. They suggested that perhaps Constance had drowned in the river, or had been taken by wild animals, or had found help from sympathetic strangers. They never mentioned the patterns in the cloth, or the stories about doorways between worlds, or the fact that Constance had spent months asking careful questions about Ruthanne's quilt and the techniques she had used to create it. What Caldwell could not have known, what the entire structure of slavery was designed to prevent him from knowing, was that Ruthanne's example had inspired others. The story of her disappearance had spread through the network of enslaved people who moved between plantations, who were hired out to work in Charleston, who attended the rare gatherings where people from different estates could meet and exchange information. The story had been modified and embellished as it traveled, but its essential message remained clear. There was a way out that had nothing to do with running through forests or hiding in ships bound for northern ports. There was a way out that involved old knowledge, careful preparation, and the creation of physical objects that could serve as keys to unlock doors that most people did not even know existed. Some who heard the story dismissed it as fantasy, as wishful thinking that provided psychological comfort but no practical means of escape. But others listened more carefully, paid attention to the details that were shared about the patterns Ruthanne had used, the specific combinations of colors and shapes that apparently held power. These people began their own experiments, working in secret during the few hours they had to themselves, creating small pieces of fabric or drawing designs in dirt that they quickly erased, testing whether they could replicate whatever Ruthanne had discovered or created. Most of these attempts produced nothing. The fabric remained just fabric, the patterns were just patterns, and the people who created them remained trapped in the same circumstances they had always endured. But occasionally, very occasionally, something worked. A person would disappear under circumstances that defied explanation, leaving behind objects that retained warmth or showed other inexplicable properties. These disappearances were rare enough that they could be explained away by the white population as conventional escapes that happened to be particularly successful. But among the enslaved community, they were understood as something different, as proof that the doorways were real, and that the knowledge of how to create them could be learned and passed on. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, there had been at least 17 documented cases in the Charleston region of enslaved people disappearing in ways that seemed to involve supernatural or unexplainable elements. The actual number was probably higher because not all such disappearances were recorded or reported in ways that preserved the unusual details. But even 17 cases over 30 years represented something significant, a pattern that suggested systematic knowledge rather than random occurrence or coincidence. During the war years, when the normal structures of plantation life were disrupted by military campaigns and economic chaos, the disappearances became slightly more common. It was as if the upheaval in the physical world created openings in whatever barrier separated ordinary reality from the elsewhere that people like Ruthanne had accessed. Union soldiers who occupied plantations in the Charleston area after 1863 reported strange phenomena: quilts and woven goods that seemed to generate their own heat, sounds of singing or humming that came from empty rooms, the sensation of being watched by presences that could not be seen. Most of the soldiers dismissed these experiences as the products of fatigue or imagination, or the general strangeness of occupying hostile territory. But a few took the reports more seriously, interviewed the formerly enslaved people who remained on the properties, and heard stories that challenged everything they thought they understood about the nature of reality. One Union officer, a captain from Massachusetts named Benjamin Frost, became particularly interested in these accounts. He had been educated at Harvard and had some familiarity with philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness and reality. He found the stories the freed people told him to be internally consistent in ways that suggested they were describing actual experiences rather than simply repeating folklore. He began collecting testimony, writing down the details of disappearances and the descriptions of objects left behind, trying to find patterns that might explain what was happening. Captain Frost's notes, which survived the war and eventually ended up in a university archive, provided some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the phenomenon. He described interviewing an elderly woman named Sarah who claimed to have known Ruthanne Jones personally, who had been a young girl on the Witfield estate when Ruthanne disappeared. Sarah described Ruthanne as quiet and focused, as someone who listened more than she spoke, who seemed to be working toward some goal that she never explicitly articulated. Sarah remembered watching Ruthanne work on the quilt, remembered how the patterns seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which you viewed them, how the cloth sometimes seemed to shimmer or glow in the candlelight. Sarah also told Captain Frost about the teachings that had been passed down from the older generation, about practices that had originated in Africa and had been preserved through oral tradition despite every effort to suppress them. She spoke of how certain symbols held power, how specific combinations of colors and shapes could influence the structure of reality if used correctly, how the act of creation, whether through weaving or stitching or singing or dancing, could be a form of magic if performed with the right intention and knowledge. She was careful in how she explained these things, watching Captain Frost's reactions, gauging whether he would dismiss her as ignorant or superstitious, or whether he might actually be willing to consider that there were forms of knowledge and power that his education had not taught him about. Captain Frost, to his credit, listened with an open mind. He did not immediately reject what Sarah told him, though he also did not uncritically accept every detail. He asked questions, sought clarification, tried to understand the underlying principles that seemed to govern these practices. And the more he learned, the more he became convinced that something real was happening, that the disappearances were not simply successful escapes by conventional means, but were evidence of something more profound, something that challenged the materialist assumptions that dominated scientific and philosophical thought in his era. After the war ended and slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment in 1865, Captain Frost returned to Massachusetts but maintained correspondence with several of the people he had interviewed in Charleston. He continued to collect stories and documentation, continued to try to understand the mechanisms by which people like Ruthanne had apparently managed to transport themselves to somewhere else. He never published his findings during his lifetime, perhaps because he feared the ridicule that would follow from presenting such material in academic circles. But his notes survived, passed down through his family, eventually discovered by researchers in the 20th century, who recognized their historical and anthropological value. The end of slavery transformed the meaning of Ruthanne's story in significant ways. When escape from slavery had been necessary for survival and freedom, the knowledge of how to create doorways had been precious and carefully guarded. But once legal freedom had been achieved, at least in theory, the urgency surrounding these practices diminished. Some of the knowledge was lost as the older generation died, and the younger generation, born into freedom, however qualified and incomplete that freedom might be, had less need to learn techniques for supernatural escape. The stories persisted, but they gradually became more symbolic, more about cultural identity and resistance and the preservation of African traditions than about practical methods for leaving one world and entering another. Yet the disappearances did not stop entirely, even after emancipation. There were still cases, though less frequent, of people vanishing under circumstances that suggested something more than ordinary absence. A woman in 1872 disappeared from her home in Charleston, leaving behind a quilt that showed patterns similar to those Ruthanne had used. A man in 1889 vanished from a church meeting, and witnesses reported that the last thing they saw was him touching a banner that had been decorated with specific symbols and designs. These later cases suggested that the knowledge had not been completely lost, that some people still maintained the ability to access whatever doorways or passages Ruthanne had discovered. Dr. Helena Pierce, in her research a century later, interviewed descendants of people who had known some of these later individuals who had disappeared. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of a continuing tradition, though one that was fading and fragmenting as the generations passed. The knowledge was becoming incomplete, like a recipe that had been partially forgotten, or instructions that had been passed down with some steps missing. People still attempted to create the patterns and perform the practices, but fewer and fewer succeeded in achieving the results that Ruthanne and others in the earlier era had managed. One of Dr. Pierce's most valuable informants was a woman named Grace Williams, who was in her 80s when Dr. Pierce interviewed her in 1970. Grace's grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation near Charleston and had known several people who had disappeared in the manner associated with Ruthanne's case. Grace had grown up hearing stories about these disappearances, had learned some of the patterns and symbols from her grandmother, though she admitted that much of the knowledge had been lost by the time it reached her generation. She showed Dr. Pierce a quilt that her grandmother had made, pointing out patterns that she said were related to the doorway symbols, though she was not certain she was interpreting them correctly. What struck Dr. Pierce most powerfully about her conversations with Grace and other elderly informants was the matter-of-fact way they discussed these events. They did not present the disappearances as miracles or impossibilities, but as natural consequences of knowledge applied correctly. They spoke of the doorways the way someone might speak of any learned skill, as something that required training and practice and understanding, but that was not fundamentally different from other forms of expertise. The supernatural elements, from their perspective, were only supernatural from the viewpoint of people who had never been taught about them. From the viewpoint of those who carried the knowledge, they were simply aspects of reality that most people did not perceive or understand. Dr. Pierce's work helped to spark renewed interest in these traditions among African American artists and scholars in the 1970s and 80s. Quilters began deliberately incorporating the patterns that had been associated with Ruthanne and others, both as a way of honoring their ancestors and as an exploration of whether the old practices might still hold power. Some of these artists approached the work purely symbolically, creating quilts that referenced the historical tradition without any expectation that the fabric they created would actually open doorways to other dimensions. But others took the spiritual and metaphysical aspects more seriously, attempting to recreate the conditions and techniques that Ruthanne had apparently used, wondering whether it might still be possible to access whatever elsewhere she had discovered. One of these artists was a woman named Josephine Reed, a quilter and textile artist based in Charleston who became fascinated by Ruthanne's story in the 1980s. Josephine spent years researching the historical records, studying the patterns that had been documented in various accounts. learning traditional African textile techniques that had largely disappeared from common practice in the United States. She created a series of quilts that she explicitly described as attempts to recreate Ruthanne's doorway quilt, using the same combinations of colors and patterns that had been described in historical sources. Josephine's quilts attracted significant attention in the art world. They were exhibited in galleries and museums, written about in art journals and cultural studies publications. Critics praised them as beautiful objects that engaged meaningfully with African American history and the legacy of slavery. But Josephine herself insisted that her work was not purely artistic or symbolic. She believed, or at least claimed to believe, that she was actually creating functional objects, that the patterns she stitched held real power, that somewhere in the process of making these quilts she might stumble upon the correct combination that would allow her to follow Ruthanne through the doorway. Whether Josephine ever succeeded in her goal was a matter of some debate. She died in 2003, and her family reported that they found her in her studio, sitting in her chair with one of her quilts draped across her lap, looking peaceful and still. The medical examiner determined that she had died of natural causes, a heart attack or stroke, though there were some odd details in the report. The quilt that had been on her lap was warm when her daughter found her, hours after death, warm enough that the daughter initially thought her mother might still be alive. And there were threads scattered across the floor of the studio, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, though they were disturbed when people walked through the room and were never properly documented. Josephine's death or disappearance or transition, whatever interpretation one chose to apply to the event, renewed interest in Ruthanne's story among a new generation. Bloggers and podcast hosts discussed the parallels between the two cases. Documentary filmmakers explored the history of textile traditions among enslaved people and their descendants. Museums in Charleston created exhibits about quilting as resistance and cultural preservation. And a new wave of artists and craftspeople began experimenting with the patterns, some approaching them as historical recreation, others treating them as active spiritual practices, still others occupying some ambiguous space between skepticism and belief. The question of whether the doorways were real, whether Ruthanne and others had actually transported themselves to another dimension, or had simply escaped through conventional means and left behind objects that people invested with supernatural significance, remained unresolved. The evidence was circumstantial and open to multiple interpretations. Skeptics could point to the lack of any physical mechanism by which stitched patterns could alter the structure of space-time or create portals between worlds. Believers could point to the consistency of the accounts across time and geography, the specific details that appeared repeatedly in stories told by people who had no contact with each other, the objects that displayed properties that seemed to defy mundane explanation. But perhaps the truth or falsity of the supernatural claims was less important than what the stories represented and accomplished. Whether or not Ruthanne actually walked through a doorway stitched from cotton and thread, her story had provided hope and inspiration to people who desperately needed both. It had preserved knowledge and cultural practices that might otherwise have been lost. It had demonstrated that creativity could be a form of resistance, that the work of hands could carry meanings and purposes that went far beyond the superficial or functional. It had insisted that enslaved people were not simply victims to be pitied or property to be inventoried, but were people with agency and knowledge and power. People who found ways to assert their humanity and their rights even under conditions designed to deny both. In contemporary Charleston, Ruthanne's story had become part of the city's cultural landscape. Tour guides told it to visitors, sometimes presenting it as verified history, sometimes framing it as legend or folklore, always emphasizing its significance as an example of resistance and cultural preservation. Local historians debated the details, arguing about which accounts were most reliable, which elements were likely historical fact and which were later embellishments. Artists continued to create works inspired by the story, from quilts that referenced the original patterns to sculptures and paintings that explored themes of escape and transformation, and the boundaries between worlds. A small museum dedicated to African American history in Charleston included a permanent exhibit about Ruthanne and the tradition of textile work among enslaved women. The exhibit displayed reproductions of patterns associated with doorway quilts, along with historical documents and artifacts related to slavery and resistance. It included video interviews with descendants of enslaved people who shared the stories that had been passed down through their families. And it featured a small, climate-controlled room where visitors could sit quietly with a reproduction of what Ruthanne's quilt might have looked like, based on historical descriptions and traditional African textile patterns. Many visitors to this room reported unusual experiences. Some felt unexpected warmth emanating from the quilt reproduction, even though the room was kept cool to protect the fabric. Others heard faint humming or singing that seemed to come from no identifiable source. Still others reported the sensation of presences in the room, of being surrounded by people they could not see but whose existence they could somehow sense. The museum staff, accustomed to such reports, neither confirmed nor denied them, simply noted that many people found the room to be emotionally powerful, and that strong emotional responses sometimes produced unusual perceptions. In the broader landscape of American history and culture, Ruthanne's story represented something important about how we understand and remember the past. It stood as a reminder that official histories, the accounts preserved in documents and legal records and newspapers, captured only a fraction of what actually happened. The experiences and knowledge of enslaved people, of women, of anyone whose voice was systematically excluded from official record-keeping, survived through different channels. Oral tradition, material culture, practices and beliefs passed from one generation to the next through demonstration and participation rather than through written text. The story also raised questions about the nature of evidence and belief. In an era that privileged scientific rationalism and empirical verification, how should we treat accounts of events that seem to violate known physical laws? Should we dismiss them automatically as impossible? Or should we remain open to the possibility that there are aspects of reality that our current scientific understanding has not yet explained or even detected? The disappearances associated with Ruthanne and others could be explained away as conventional escapes combined with wishful thinking and cultural mythology. But they could also be taken as evidence that the universe contains more mysteries than we have yet fathomed, that human consciousness and intention might have capacities that we have barely begun to understand. Scholars who studied consciousness and parapsychology occasionally referenced Ruthanne's case in their work, though usually cautiously and with appropriate disclaimers about the unreliability of historical accounts and the problem of evidence. Some suggested that if the reported phenomena were real, they might be related to what some researchers called psi abilities, the hypothetical capacity of consciousness to interact with physical reality in ways that transcended known sensory mechanisms. Others proposed that the doorways, if they existed, might be related to theoretical concepts from physics, like wormholes or parallel universes or higher spatial dimensions that consciousness could somehow access under certain conditions. These speculations remained firmly in the realm of the theoretical and the controversial. No one had successfully demonstrated the existence of doorways created through textile patterns under controlled laboratory conditions. No one had produced a quilt that reliably transported people to other dimensions. The phenomenon, if it was a phenomenon and not simply a collection of misinterpreted events and cultural mythology, remained stubbornly resistant to scientific investigation. Yet the stories persisted, and new accounts continued to emerge. In 2015, a woman in Charleston named Diana Foster reported that her grandmother had disappeared in a manner eerily similar to the historical cases. The grandmother, who had been a quilter and had spent years studying the patterns associated with Ruthanne's story, had been found sitting in her sewing room, peaceful and still, with a newly completed quilt draped across her lap. The room was warm despite the air conditioning running full blast, and the quilt itself seemed to generate heat that persisted for hours after the grandmother's body was removed. Diana claimed that her grandmother had spoken repeatedly in the weeks before her death about finally understanding the patterns, about having figured out what Ruthanne had known, about being ready to take the journey. Diana's account was dismissed by many as the grief-stricken interpretation of an ordinary death. But she maintained her story, and she refused to sell or donate the quilt her grandmother had completed, despite offers from museums and collectors. She kept it in her home, wrapped carefully in acid-free paper stored in a cedar chest that she opened only rarely. She said the quilt still felt warm when she touched it, that sometimes at night she heard humming coming from the room where the chest was kept, that she had dreams in which her grandmother appeared and spoke about the place where she now existed, a place that Diana described as being simultaneously very close to and very far from the world we inhabit. Stories like Diana's contributed to the ongoing legend, adding contemporary layers to a narrative that had begun nearly 2 centuries earlier. They suggested that whatever Ruthanne had discovered or created was not confined to a specific historical moment, but was something that could potentially be accessed across time, that the knowledge she had possessed could still be learned and applied by those willing to seek it out and practice it with dedication and belief. The city of Charleston, in recognition of the story's cultural significance, eventually created a small memorial to Ruthanne in one of the historic parks. It consisted of a bronze plaque mounted on a stone marker with text that carefully balanced historical fact with acknowledgement of the legendary elements. The plaque noted that Ruthanne Jones had been enslaved on the Witfield estate, that she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1832, and that her story had become an important part of African American cultural heritage in Charleston. It mentioned the quilt and the patterns she had created, describing them as examples of how enslaved people had preserved African cultural traditions and had used creativity as a form of resistance. The memorial became a gathering place for people interested in Ruthanne's story. Quilters sometimes held meetings there, working on their own projects while sitting on the benches near the marker. Teachers brought school groups to learn about slavery and resistance and the ways that history survived through stories and material culture. And occasionally people came alone, late at night, and left offerings at the base of the marker. Spools of thread, scraps of fabric, small handmade quilts with patterns that referenced the designs Ruthanne had used. The park maintenance staff regularly cleared away these offerings, but they always reappeared, left by people who felt compelled to honor Ruthanne's memory, and perhaps to invoke her protection or her blessing, or simply to acknowledge the debt that contemporary people owed to those who had suffered and resisted and created under impossible conditions. As the years passed and the 21st century progressed, Ruthanne's story continued to evolve and accumulate new meanings. It was referenced in novels and poems, in songs and theatrical productions, in visual art and dance performances. Each new interpretation added something to the legend, highlighted different aspects, connected Ruthanne's experience to contemporary concerns and struggles. Some artists emphasized the supernatural elements, creating works that explored themes of magic and transformation and the permeability of boundaries between worlds. Others focused on the historical reality of slavery and resistance, using Ruthanne's story as a starting point for broader explorations of African American history and culture. The debate about whether the doorways were real or metaphorical continued with passionate advocates on both sides. But increasingly, people began to recognize that this was perhaps a false dichotomy, that something could be metaphorically true and historically powerful, even if it could not be verified through conventional empirical methods. The doorways Ruthanne created, whether they were literal portals to other dimensions or symbolic representations of psychological and spiritual liberation, had real effects in the world. They influenced how people understood their history and their possibilities. They preserved knowledge and cultural practices. They provided hope and inspiration. And perhaps that was enough to make them real in the ways that mattered most. In the slave quarters that once stood behind the Witfield house, in the space that had become a parking lot in the late 20th century, people sometimes reported strange occurrences even in the modern era. Drivers would find their cars warmer than they should be after sitting in the winter cold. Children playing in adjacent lots would hear humming that their parents could not detect. Teenagers daring each other to stand in certain spots after dark would feel sudden warmth surrounding them, or would see brief flashes of light that seemed to have no source. These experiences were infrequent and easily dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but they contributed to the sense that something of Ruthanne remained, that her act of resistance and transformation had left an imprint on the physical space that persisted across time. The thread that had rolled across the floor on the morning of her disappearance, trailing behind nothing visible, had become a symbol in its own right. Artists created sculptures and installations featuring spools of thread that appeared to unwind themselves, creating patterns on floors and walls. Poets wrote about the thread as a metaphor for connection and continuity, for the ways that past and present remained linked through story and memory. And practical quilters, going about their work with no particular interest in metaphysics or history, sometimes experienced odd moments when their thread seemed to move on its own, when their needles seemed guided by hands other than their own, when the patterns they created seemed to carry meanings they had not consciously intended. The Whitfield family line eventually died out in the early 20th century, the last descendant passing away without heirs in 1923. The estate was sold and resold, divided and subdivided, until nothing remained of the original plantation except scattered documents in historical archives and the stories that persisted in local memory. But interestingly, several people who had lived on or owned portions of the former Whitfield property over the years reported recurring dreams about a tall woman stitching by candlelight, about patterns that seemed to contain hidden messages about the sensation of warmth that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. These dreams were detailed and consistent enough across different people who had no knowledge of each other's experiences, that researchers who collected such accounts found them difficult to explain as mere coincidence. One particularly striking case involved a family who purchased a house built on what had been the northwestern corner of the Whitfield estate in 1968. The family's teenage daughter, a girl named Rebecca who had no particular interest in history or quilting, began having intense dreams about an enslaved woman named Ruthanne. In these dreams, Ruthanne showed Rebecca patterns and symbols, explaining their meanings and purposes, teaching her how to combine colors and shapes in ways that held power. Rebecca, who had never quilted before, became obsessed with the craft, spending all her free time creating pieces that incorporated the patterns from her dreams. Her parents were concerned enough to take her to a therapist, worried that she was experiencing some form of psychological disturbance. But the therapist, after several sessions, concluded that Rebecca was not suffering from any mental illness. Instead, she seemed to be accessing information through her dreams, though the therapist had no explanation for how this was possible or where the information was coming from. When Rebecca's mother showed some of her daughter's quilts to a historian specializing in African American textile traditions, the historian was astonished. Rebecca had recreated with remarkable accuracy patterns that were known to have been used by enslaved women in the Charleston region in the 19th century. Patterns that were documented in archives and museum collections, but that were certainly not widely known or easily accessible to a teenage girl in 1968. Rebecca continued quilting throughout her life, eventually becoming a respected textile artist whose work was exhibited in galleries and museums. She always maintained that she was not creating the patterns herself, but was channeling them from somewhere else, from someone else. She spoke of feeling Ruthanne's presence when she worked, of sensing guidance from hands that touched her own but could not be seen, of accessing knowledge that she had no conventional way of knowing. Her quilts were beautiful and powerful, carrying a sense of purpose and meaning that went beyond aesthetic appeal. People who viewed them often reported feeling moved or changed in some way, as if the fabric carried messages that spoke directly to something deep within their consciousness. The scientific community predictably had difficulty with cases like Rebecca's. They could not explain how she had accessed such specific historical information through dreams, but they were reluctant to accept explanations that involved communication with the dead, or the existence of some kind of collective cultural memory that transcended individual minds. Some researchers suggested that Rebecca might have encountered the information through forgotten sources, books, or documentaries she had seen as a child and consciously forgotten, but that her subconscious mind retained and later presented to her in the form of dreams. Others proposed that the correlation between her patterns and historical examples might be coincidental, that there were only so many ways to combine shapes and colors, and that similar patterns might arise independently in different times and places. But these explanations felt inadequate to many people, especially to those who had their own experiences with the phenomenon, who had felt the warmth of certain quilts or heard the humming in empty rooms or sensed presences that could not be accounted for through conventional means. They knew, in a way that transcended intellectual argument or empirical proof, that something real was happening, that Ruthanne and others like her had accessed or created something that persisted beyond their physical existence, that the doorways they had opened remained available to those who knew how to find them or who were chosen to receive the knowledge. As the 21st century entered its third decade, interest in Ruthanne's story showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it seemed to be growing, spreading beyond Charleston and beyond the United States to reach people around the world who found meaning and inspiration in the account of a woman who had refused to accept her captivity and had created her own liberation through knowledge and craft and determination. Social media platforms carried discussions about the story, with people sharing their own experiences with quilts and patterns and unexpected warmth, with others debating the historical accuracy and supernatural claims, with still others using Ruthanne's example as inspiration for their own creative and spiritual practices. A documentary film about Ruthanne's story, released in 2022, reached millions of viewers through streaming platforms. The film carefully presented multiple perspectives, interviewing historians who discussed the historical context of slavery in Charleston, scientists who explored possible explanations for the reported phenomena, artists who had been inspired by Ruthanne's example, and descendants of enslaved people who shared the stories that had been passed down through their families. The film did not attempt to definitively prove or disprove the supernatural elements of the story. Instead, it acknowledged the mystery while exploring what the story meant to different people and why it continued to resonate so powerfully nearly 2 centuries after the events it described. Following the documentary's release, tourism to Charleston increased, with many visitors specifically seeking out sites associated with Ruthanne's story. The memorial in the park became a popular destination, often crowded with people taking photographs, leaving offerings, or simply sitting quietly and contemplating the bronze plaque's sparse text. The small museum with its reproduction quilt room saw attendance triple, with visitors waiting in line for the opportunity to sit in that climate-controlled space and see if they too might experience the warmth or hear the humming that so many others had reported. Local businesses capitalized on the interest, selling quilts and textile products marketed as being inspired by Ruthanne's patterns. Some of these products were tasteful and well-made, created by skilled artisans who genuinely understood and respected the historical and cultural significance of what they were producing. Others were cheap tourist trinkets that reduced the story to a commercial opportunity. This commodification troubled some people, who felt that it disrespected Ruthanne's memory and the serious spiritual and historical meanings associated with her story. But others argued that the widespread interest, even when it took commercial forms, helped to keep the story alive and ensured that new generations would encounter it and potentially be inspired by it. The debate about authenticity and respect, about who had the right to tell Ruthanne's story and how it should be told, became contentious at times. Some descendants of enslaved people felt that the story belonged to their community and should not be appropriated or commercialized by people outside that community. Others welcomed the broader interest, seeing it as an opportunity to educate people about the history and ongoing legacy of slavery, about the strength and creativity of people who had resisted oppression in countless ways. These conversations were difficult and sometimes painful, but they were also necessary, part of the ongoing work of understanding how we relate to history and whose voices have authority to interpret and present that history. In the midst of these debates and discussions, the essential truth of Ruthanne's story remained: that a woman who had been enslaved, who had been denied the most basic human freedoms, had found or created a way to liberate herself that defied the logic and mechanisms of the system that oppressed her. Whether that liberation took the form of physical transportation to another dimension or represented a more metaphorical achievement of spiritual and psychological freedom, or both, or something that transcended the distinction between physical and metaphorical, the accomplishment was profound. Ruthanne had insisted on her humanity and her agency in a world that denied both. She had used the skills and knowledge available to her to create something that her oppressors could neither understand nor control. And in doing so, she had given hope and inspiration to generations of people who followed her, who looked to her example when they needed to believe that change was possible, that escape was possible, that the world could be different than it was. The half-finished quilt, even in its absence, even as a thing that existed now only in descriptions and attempted recreations, continued to serve as a reminder that the work of liberation is always unfinished, that each generation inherits both the accomplishments and the incomplete projects of those who came before. Ruthanne had stitched her portion of the pattern, had created her doorway and stepped through it. But the larger work of creating a world where everyone could live in freedom and dignity remained ongoing. The thread she had pulled through cotton continued to extend forward in time, connecting her act of resistance to every subsequent effort to challenge oppression and claim human rights and dignity. On quiet mornings in Charleston, particularly in November when the anniversary of her disappearance approached, attentive observers might notice things that seemed slightly out of place or inexplicable. A spool of thread rolling across a sidewalk with no apparent force moving it. A pattern of shadows on a wall that resembled the designs Ruthanne had stitched. A warmth in the air that had no meteorological explanation. These small anomalies were easy to dismiss as coincidence or misperception, and most people who noticed them did dismiss them. But some people paid attention, recognized the signs, understood that they were being reminded of something important, of a truth that Ruthanne had known and had embodied in her final work before she disappeared. that reality was more malleable than it seemed, that consciousness and intention could shape the world in ways that transcended the merely physical, that doors existed if you knew how to create them and had the courage to step through. The legacy of Ruthanne Jones, slave girl who left the quilt half-stitched and breathing warm, extended far beyond her own time and place. It touched every person who learned her story and found in it something that spoke to their own struggles and aspirations. It influenced artists and activists, historians and dreamers. Anyone who needed to believe that change was possible and that creativity could be a form of power. It preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Knowledge about African cultural traditions and textile practices and forms of resistance that operated outside the visible structures of political and military conflict. It insisted that the people who had been enslaved were not merely victims to be pitied, but were active agents who found countless ways to resist and survive and create meaning and beauty even under conditions designed to destroy them. And somewhere in whatever place Ruthanne had gone when she stepped through the doorway her quilt had created, perhaps she continued her work. Perhaps she stitched new patterns, taught others the techniques she had mastered, welcomed those who followed the path she had marked out. Perhaps she looked back sometimes toward the world she had left behind, watching as her story spread and evolved, as new generations discovered the power of needle and thread and determination. As the warmth she had left behind continued to offer comfort and hope to those who needed it most. Perhaps she smiled to see her legacy growing and changing, taking forms she had never imagined, but that carried forward the essential truth she had known, that no system of oppression, however total it might seem, could completely contain the human spirit's capacity for resistance and creation and transformation. The quilt remained half-finished, would always remain half-finished because the work it represented could never be fully completed as long as injustice and oppression existed in the world. But the warmth it radiated, the heat of living presence and determination and hope, that warmth persisted. It moved through time and space, touching people who had never heard of Ruthanne Jones, inspiring acts of courage and creativity that rippled outward in ways that could not be measured or fully tracked. The thread continued to unwind, to trail through the world, leaving patterns in its wake, connecting past to present to future, linking all those who refused to accept that the world as it was represented the only world that could be. Ruthanne of Charleston disappeared on a November morning in 1832, leaving behind a mystery that would never be fully solved, a quilt that would never be finished, and a legacy that would never die. She stepped from slavery into freedom, from captivity into possibility, from the world that tried to own her into a world that she created for herself. And in that stepping, in that moment of transformation and liberation, she became something more than a person. She became a symbol, an inspiration, a reminder that human beings possess capacities for resistance and creation that transcend the systems designed to control them. That doors exist where none seem possible. That warmth persists even in the coldest circumstances. That the work of hands joined with the determination of spirit can change the very fabric of reality itself. The story continues as stories do, passed from one person to another, evolving with each telling, gathering new meanings while retaining its essential truth. The quilt remains unfinished but warm, breathing with the presence of all those who have touched it through story and memory and creative practice. The thread unwinds endlessly, marking paths that lead from then to now, from there to here, from what was to what might yet be. And somewhere in Charleston, or in the space between dimensions, or in the collective memory of a people who refused to be destroyed by their oppression, Ruthanne Jones continues her work, continues to stitch patterns that hold power, continues to create doorways for those who need them, continues to offer the warmth of her presence and the inspiration of her example to all who would follow the path she marked out on that November morning so long ago when she left the quilt half-stitched and breathing warm and walked into freedom.